of the United Negro College Fund. CNN anchor Judy Woodruff will moderate the event. Join us for live coverage on our companion network, C-SPAN 2. Today in New York City, the FBI issued a final report on the crash of TWA Flight 800, which went down off the coast of Long Island in July 1996, killing all aboard. In announcing the end of the investigation, the FBI detailed evidence, ruling out the possibility of criminal activity surrounding the crash. The FBI's news conference is next. It's about 90 minutes long.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody. I appreciate the attendance of this much media. It's been a long time. In fact, yesterday was 16 months of this tragic anniversary. It's been a heck of a team effort, and I'd like to take the time to introduce the agencies that played such a crucial role in the investigation that we're about to talk to today. And I'm going to introduce my right to my left, first row first, is Hank Ballas from ATF, Jim McMahon, the Superintendent of New York State Police, Fred Marone, the Director of the Port Authority Police, Pat Kelleher, the First Deputy Police Commissioner, City of New York, Jim Hall, Chairman of NTSB, Valerie Caproni, the Chief of the Criminal Division of the Eastern District of New York, John Gallagher, the Commissioner of the Suffolk County Police, Joe Monteith, the Chief of Department, Suffolk County, Fred Krug, the SAC of the Diplomatic Security Service, U.S. State Department, Captain Lawrence Brooks, the Deputy Commander of Activities, New York, United States Coast Guard, John Verone, the SAC of U.S. Customs, Ed McElroy, the District Director of INS, Brian Gimlet, the SAC of the United States Secret Service, Arlene Feldman, the Regional Administrator of the FAA, and Mel Kenny, the Deputy Commissioner of the Nassau County Police Department. I wish also that my compadre for many, many months in this investigation, from me, Bob Francis, could be here today, but he's out of the country. It was a great team, and I think that's what is the hallmark of investigations in this metropolitan area. I think that people can be proud of the fact that all of us work together. I'm honored to stand up here today and represent all these agencies and outline for you this investigation. As I said, 16 months ago, yesterday, this tragedy happened. And from the very beginning, the FBI and the other members of the law enforcement team worked closely with NTSB. The mission of the law enforcement team was to determine whether a criminal act was responsible for this disaster. The time has arrived to report to the American people, and certainly to the victims' families, a few of which we have here today, and we're honored that they're here, the results of that effort. Following 16 months of unprecedented investigation, effort which extended from the shores of Long Island to several countries abroad, an investigation where hundreds of investigators conducted thousands of interviews, an investigation which was confronted with the obstacles of having the most critical pieces of evidence lying in 130 feet of water at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. We must now report that no evidence has been found which would indicate that a criminal act was the cause of the tragedy of TWA Flight 800. We do know one thing, however. The law team has done everything humanly possible, has pursued every lead, has looked at every theory, and has left no stone unturned. Now I'd like to outline for you the investigation. It'll take some time. As we know, TWA Flight 800 was on tarmac at John F. Kennedy International Airport for approximately 3 hours and 48 minutes prior to departure. The outside temperature was 81 degrees. The flight arrived from Athens at 4:31 p.m. and lifted off the ground at 8:19 p.m. At approximately 8:31 p.m., the flight experienced the tragic mid-air explosion. I was in New York, and many of the law enforcement heads were at a dinner for Ray Kelly, a former police commissioner, when all of the beepers went off. And the initial information I had in the first 10 minutes after calling the office was that we had a 747 in the water off of Suffolk County. There were reports of a massive fireball. Initial reports from FAA was there were no unusual communications from the airplane. The vectoring out of Kennedy Airport, the handoff to Boston Center, was normal. Almost immediately, reports of objects in the sky were reported, initially from flight crews transiting the airspace. As you can imagine, we didn't know, we had no evidence, but there was a chance, whether it was 10% in your mind or 90% in your mind, or our mind, there was a chance that this was a criminal act of terrorism, and even possibly an act of war if it was sponsored by a state. Almost immediately, we dispatched hundreds and hundreds of agents and police officers and established command centers in the New York office, United States Coast Guard station in Mauritius, this peaceful, lovely little Coast Guard station with the sign, "Remember, keep off the grass." The West Hampton Fire Department, and later, the old Grumman F-14 Tomcat facility in Calverton, Long Island. All the federal agencies of the task force, all the federal law enforcement agencies who are part of the task force obviously responded and assisted in this team effort. All the local law enforcement agencies that were pertinent, and certainly the NYPD, the New York State Police, Suffolk, Nassau, Port Authority, played huge and critical roles in the investigation, particularly Suffolk County, whose county, for lack of a better word, forget international waters, whose county bore the brunt of the emergency response. Of course, the fire departments, many local volunteer fire departments, Red Cross, who, by the way, were absolutely superb throughout, and the Suffolk County Medical Examiner's Office, clergy, and all the emergency response apparatus of the county and the state responded with great dispatch, great professionalism. The recovery effort, as you might remember, was massive. In the first 3 days, the Coast Guard and boaters in their own private boats from Suffolk and Nassau and elsewhere played a huge role, a heroic role, in recovering the bodies floating on the water and recovering hundreds and hundreds of pieces of the airplane that now made a large, tragic slick across the beautiful Atlantic Ocean. You'll recall the dive efforts that commenced once the entire salvage capability of the U.S. Navy arrived on scene. 4,600 dives made by the Navy and made by the law enforcement divers over a search area of 40 square miles. The divers, the Coast Guardsmen, many others in this investigation were heroes in every sense of the word. You might remember after the diving ceased, the trawling operations that took place for months, covering 75 square miles of the Atlantic Ocean. We're all pleased for the families that we recovered, the team, 230, which is all of the victims of this tragedy, and positively identify them. It took a period of time, but we did it. We recovered approximately 96% of the aircraft, close to 1 million pieces of this airplane in the hangar at Calverton. We recovered 39,600 items of personal effects in the tragic job of cataloging, dealing with, boxing, identifying those items. Those items that meant so much, I'm sure, and I know, to the family members. We started a massive investigation at Kennedy Airport, obviously. We interviewed hundreds of people We wanted to know everyone that touched the airplane. They were the security personnel, the mechanics, the fuelers, the luggage, the cargo handlers, the caterers, the cleaners, the customer service reps, the Ogden Food Service, and many outside contractors that provided in-flight movies, special catering, linen, dry cleaning, everybody. All passengers' flight coupons were matched to the passenger manifest, and all checked baggage was accounted for prior to departure. We're satisfied of that. Likewise, all cargo was identified from point of origin until placement on Flight 800. All shippers were identified, and appropriate investigation was conducted. So we knew what was on that plane, where it came from, who boxed it, how did it get there, where was it destined, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, throughout, the FAA has been tremendously cooperative with us, as they are in many, many things, and we certainly interviewed all the air traffic controllers. We looked at all the radar tapes along with NTSB, who had the primary responsibility for that. Of course, they were duplicated and analyzed. All the air traffic controller transcripts were obtained and reviewed. Thanks to the Greek officials in Athens, who treated us splendidly, we conducted, with their help, they conducted, with our help, I should say, another similar investigation in Athens as we did at Kennedy Airport. Again, wanting to know who was touching this plane. We conducted 452 interviews. That number also included the list I read before, but all the passengers that were on that flight. As you know, that flight was TWA Flight 881, which left Athens and landed at Kennedy Airport. Like John F. Kennedy Airport investigation, all the passenger flight coupons were matched to the passenger manifest, and all passenger baggage was identified. And likewise, we authenticated all cargo, all shippers, and no cargo, it's important to note, was from Flight 881 was placed on TWA Flight 800. Now, in furtherance of the bomb investigation, the question, was there a bomb? Was there some device that was put on the plane, brought on the plane? We eventually interviewed, we put it off for a while, the victim family members of TWA Flight 100. We have to do that regarding possible sabotage, conspiracy to bomb, or other potential criminal acts. I will note to you that 5 of the victims' families refused to be interviewed, and we did not see the need to push that issue. The investigators of this task force reviewed 10 previous airline bombings covering a period of the last 14 years, the purpose of which was to identify what took place in those bombings, the vulnerable areas, the placement of the explosive device if we knew, and certainly the modus operandi if we knew of the bombers. The cockpit voice recorder tape contained 31 minutes and 47 seconds of cockpit crew ATC conversation. This tape started while the aircraft was positioned at the gate prior to takeoff and ends at the time of the explosion. All claims of responsibility were without credibility. The commercial history of the aircraft was totally reviewed. We make note that the plane was sold to the country of Iran in 1975. Iran never took physical possession. The aircraft never left the United States and was never touched by Iranian personnel or Iranian nationals. And the aircraft was subsequently, on a paper, transferred back to TWA. We did a complete review of the military history of the aircraft. Was it ever used to transport troops? We can disclose that it did transport troops to the Middle East on April 1st and 2nd of 1996. The list of the troops included 8 explosive ordnance disposal personnel. However, the records reflect that they were wearing brand new uniforms, and that, of course, all ordnance was not on the plane. No ordnance was on the plane. Things like that became apparent to us later on when, as you know, we found chemical traces on the airplane. On June 10th of '96, a while after we talked about finding high explosive chemicals on the plane, we discovered that on June 10th, '96, the St. Louis Airport Police conducted canine explosives training aboard the victim aircraft. We know that for certain. We know that was the tail number of the plane. The explosives that were put on the plane were consistent with those found. And in fact, one package was put directly over the area on the flooring that those chemicals were found. Now, in furtherance of the missile investigation, we said on, I think, day 2, we had, by that time, hundreds of witnesses that saw things in the sky, and we talked about the possibility. We had no evidence, but we had witnesses that saw things in the sky, and we talked about the possibility that a missile, as horrid as that is, could have taken down this airplane. It had 2 legs to that theory. Friendly fire, we had absolutely no reason to think that was the case, but we are in the investigation business, and we put all possibilities up on the board. So we looked at that long, long before Pierre Salinger and others talked about that, months before. And we also looked at whether or not a terrorist group or a group of criminals had deployed a shoulder man-pad type missile like a Stinger or an SA-16 or an SA-18 to shoot down the plane. We ended up with 244 eyewitnesses, all of which were located and whose accounts were documented and analyzed. I'll talk more about that later. In fact, we'll show you a videotape later that deals with the issue of what the witnesses saw. We did things like roadside checkpoints and roadblocks in the vicinity of East Mauritius to identify potential witnesses, to ask someone at the same time the next night, do you pass this way? Did you pass this way last night? Did you see something suspicious? Did you see this tragedy? We canvassed all the marinas in the tri-state area for any witnesses or suspicious activities related to the explosion. This was important because we knew the first night that if it was a man-pad type Stinger missile, it had to be fired from the water. Otherwise, it was beyond the technical specifications of those types of ordnance. We tried to freeze Suffolk County. We tried to find out who was there. Who's there on the county, who's there in the water, who could be escaping in any direction. The police departments provided all 911 telephone calls and any complaints reporting suspicious behavior, cars, boats, in all precincts bordering all waterways, including Kennedy Airport, for a period of 2 months prior to the event. And we looked at every one of those records. 29 911 calls received by Suffolk County Police were investigated and met with negative results. The idea there is that somebody saw something. Maybe has no relevance to this tragedy, but maybe it does. And that's the kind of a dragnet that typically law enforcement, especially in something this critical, would do. All reports of stolen or abandoned boats in the tri-state area were identified. Some were held for forensic examination. We wanted to look at the flooring of boats. We wanted to see if there were burn marks. That's the depth that we went, looking for a missile. The investigative team reviewed 9 missile attacks on aircraft during a previous 14-year period. These attacks occurred in the former Soviet Union, Afghanistan, and Africa. Thank God they did not occur here. The purpose of this review was to identify potential missiles utilized, launch sites, forensic evidence obtained. None was available, thereby prompting our own testing. What does a missile do to an airplane? You know, during the Gulf War, a number of our airplanes were shot with missiles. Speaking for the Navy, a number of them were shot and they all landed back on the carrier. You know, no one ever asked the question, was that a missile? They knew it was a missile. They didn't put a microscope on the metal and look at the molecules. That's what we have to do. That's what we did. We reviewed all the vessels traveling through New York Harbor. In particular, the 24-hour period, 12 before, 12 after. We identified 371 vessels in the Long Island area and did investigation on those vessels. For the 1-month period, we identified 20,000 records of vessels that entered New York Harbor and did investigation of those vessels. Investigation of Suffolk County bridge openings was conducted. 20,000 records were obtained, and every vessel that passed under 3 Suffolk County drawbridges for 3 months prior to the tragedy and 2 weeks after was recorded, and investigation was conducted. All radar data was collected, as I said earlier, reviewed, analyzed by the FAA, NTSB, and an independent radar consultant who examined the radar tapes and determined that there was depicted on the screen was normal air traffic, not a missile. Never was, never will be. The sources of the radar tapes were identified. There were 9 FAA locations: Islip, JFK, Newark, White Plains, Stewart Field, Riverhead, Traverse, Pennsylvania, North Truro, Massachusetts, and Cummington, Mass. 3 other radar sources were located and obtained: Sikorsky Aircraft in Connecticut and the 2 NOAA facilities in Boston and New York. We had a lot of radar information, ladies and gentlemen. We had a lot more than that guy in Florida had. Regarding the evidence collection, the law enforcement team personally supervised evidence collection. Now, the evidence was all the pieces. The evidence was all the cherished bodies. The crime scene, potential crime scene, was that huge area on the ocean. And I can tell you we were always mindful of contamination and chain of custody. It was a massive effort. All evidence received at the Calverton facility was initially examined by certified bomb technicians, metallurgists, and chemists for unique damage. NTSB was a full partner with us on that. Subsequently, intensive testing and examination of pieces exhibiting any unusual characteristics was conducted by law enforcement. And later, military and independent experts. Under FBI and NTSB supervision, the following agencies provided additional expertise. Now, I said often that I had at my beck and call and Jim's beck and call the resources of this government, and I did. And I asked for it. And there might have been something I didn't ask for that maybe I wouldn't have gotten, but everything I asked for, I got. And here's the following people that came and helped us with this issue, particularly on the evidence, particularly on the missile. The U.S. Naval Air Warfare Center, Weapons Division at China Lake, California. The U.S. Army Aeromedical Research Lab in Fort Rucker, Alabama. The U.S. Air Force Wright-Patterson Air Force Base Aircraft Accident Investigation Office in Dayton, Ohio. The Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Bethesda, Maryland. The Defense Intelligence Agency, Missile and Space Intelligence Center, Redstone Arsenal, Alabama. The Picatinny Arsenal. The Hughes Missile Systems, Hughes Aircraft Company. An independent radar consultant with over 30 years of experience. A contract non-government metallurgist with the highest caliber, highest credentials. And of course, we always had the assistance of the Department of Energy laboratories, in particular Brookhaven and Sandia National Labs. Now, the NTSB FBI reconstruction projects, you know a bit of that. Well, let me tell you, it resulted in extensive reconstruction of areas of the aircraft deemed to be vulnerable to a missile and/or explosive device. It was the main 92 feet of the forward fuselage, but it was also the aft cargo bay, the left and right wing spars, the cabin interior, the cargo containers, the underbelly fairing, the power cable routing, the left and right leading edge wing structures, the nose wheel well and surrounding structure, the top skin of the left wing, the cabin interior, the carpet flooring, and the flooring over the center fuel tank, the flight data recorder, cockpit voice recorder wire routing, and of course, the center fuel tank that we talked about so much and you heard so much about. Damage analysis was conducted on the combined metallurgy and engineering review of all the aircraft debris, reconstructed and non-reconstructed. The team identified over 1,400 penetrations and 259 areas of missing fuselage material. All were closely evaluated, more than once. Recovery analysis was conducted regarding the logged recovery location of all debris. Now, to summarize the forensic investigation, the team from the FBI, NTSB, and great credit to ATF, who provided almost their entire forensic laboratory on scene, and other government entities mentioned, and a private consultant, inspected almost 1 million pieces of aircraft debris visually, some multiple times. This process included over 2,000 chemical swabbings, the X-raying of all seat cushions, the use of explosive detection canines on site, examination and analysis by static detonations of missiles in pressurized and non-pressurized aircraft fuselages, and the inspection of missile-damaged aircraft. To summarize the forensic investigation, the team of FBI, NTSB, ATF, and other government agencies found nothing consistent with a bomb, a missile, or an explosive device. In particular, the combined FBI-ATF laboratory conclusion was that 1, there was no evidence of high explosive damage. 2, there was no evidence of explosion of a missile warhead. 3, there was no evidence of missile impact. Likewise, the other experts and the independent consultants concluded, 1, there was no evidence of a high explosive damage anywhere. There was no evidence of explosion of a missile warhead. There was no evidence of missile impact. The metallurgy examiner's conclusions, scientists, were that the damage was consistent with 1, the overpressurization of the center fuel tank, the breakup of the aircraft, the fire, and the impact of the aircraft into the ocean. Concerning the issue of friendly fire, I talked earlier that we looked at that from the beginning. The team conducted a total and thorough investigation. Of course, we asked the military the tough question, did you do this? And of course the answer was no. We looked behind that. We had no reason to doubt what they said, but we looked behind that. We looked at all the overhead resources of this country and other countries who cooperated. We looked at all the radar. We identified all the military assets within 200 nautical miles of this tragedy. We documented all training exercises. We accounted for all armaments capable of reaching Flight 800. Of the military assets identified, the officers and crew of the USS Normandy, a United States Navy cruiser, the USS Trepang, a U.S. Navy submarine, the USS Albuquerque, a U.S. Navy submarine, and the USS Wyoming, a U.S. Navy submarine, were interviewed, and the ships or the subs were inspected. In all cases, no weapons were fired. In all cases, no ordnance was capable. In all cases, no ordnance was expended. In addition, we looked at a U.S. Navy P-3 Orion transiting the airspace. We looked at a U.S. Air National Guard H-60 helicopter, a New York Air National Guard C-130 aircraft, a New York Air National Guard C-10, and a California Air National Guard C-141 transiting the airspace. And I must say at this point, tremendous cooperation from the state of New York, the governor, and certainly the reserve forces, the National Guard forces of this state were particularly helpful to us throughout this entire investigation. The investigation was not limited to strictly terrorist motives. All avenues of potential criminality were explored. The public was great and responded to our 800 number and our email address. I know you all got sick of hearing that during the press conferences. Of the thousands and thousands of communications we had from the public, over 3,000 leads were developed and generated through the public contact. And I thank everyone in the public, certainly all the witnesses that we dealt with, all 244 of you, and everyone that took the time to call, to write, and to write thoughtful responses and tried to be helpful. That's what this is all about, working together. In total, there were over 7,000 interviews conducted by the team in this investigation. Now let me talk about some issues that came up. Particularly relative to those that charge conspiracy. The radar return from the so-called Salinger report is and was and always will be a commercial flight, not a missile. It was positively identified as a commercial flight, Jet Express, Flight 18. The Linda Cabot photo. The photo by Miss Cabot depicts a bearing of north-northeast. TWA Flight 800 was south-southwest, almost directly behind her. The photograph was analyzed by the National Imagery and Mapping Agency. They advised that there is an object in the photo. The object is not a missile. The object appears to be an aircraft. It's not possible to absolutely identify the type of aircraft because of the distance of the object from the camera. The exact time of the photo was unknown, and there's insufficient technical detail in the photograph. The object is not a drone. We did a massive investigation on drones. One of the first things we were concerned about is drones. We knew drones fly in airspace. We know there's not a human being in a drone, at least none that I've seen. And we were concerned about drones. There were no drones in the air. All drones on the East Coast were accounted for. No damage in this airplane was caused by a drone. The Heidi Krieger photograph, the streak in the sky photograph. She gave us the negative, and I appreciate that, Heidi. The negative was examined by our FBI laboratory and determined that the streak is actually debris, a scratch on the negative. The seat cushion residue, reported in the Riverside, California press, of the red residue that someone said was rocket fuel. The truth is the material is contact adhesive. We know that for a fact. We know the manufactured formula, which is patented, and we know without doubt, without any doubt whatsoever, that it's the adhesive that holds the back of the seats together. It's not rocket fuel. It's not residue of a rocket. Never was, never will be. Regarding the U.S. military activity in training areas Whiskey 105, 106, and 107, areas closest to the shore of Long Island. As you probably know, there's training areas along the entire Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And I'm sure there's similar training areas off of other countries. Those particular areas are the closest. Those warning areas mutually coexist with commercial air traffic and were open for commercial air traffic on July 17, 1996. Understand that no commercial air traffic goes through those areas, and TWA Flight 800 didn't either. There were no missile firings for the previous 2 years, including July 17, 1996, in any of those areas. Regarding the military search and rescue exercise that was being conducted on July 17th, there were no weapons utilized. In fact, there were no weapons or ordnance of any type other than flares on board. No training exercises in any training area on July 17th, 1996 utilized any weapons whatsoever. Now let me get back to the P.S. Salinger, Ian Goddard statement. I don't mean to dwell on this, but I think it's important just to note. I had a conversation with Mr. Salinger a few weeks back where he told me on the phone that he was giving up the conspiracy theory. I also received an email from his so-called chief investigator, Mr. Goddard, a portion of which I'll read to you. Quote, "I believe promoting the Navy missile theory was a big mistake. I believe that the evidence is not sufficient to blame the Navy, and I wish to move away from that and all areas of conspiracy inquiry forever." Close quote. I appreciate these statements, even at this late date, and even after they caused, in my personal opinion, great concern, great harm, great suspicions to the families. We'll accept the truth anytime. Now, I'm about to show you a videotape. It's a little unprecedented for us to show a videotape. It's a little unprecedented for us to actually stand up here and talk about an investigation. But this was such an immense tragedy, with so many ramifications, and it still is, that I think it's important that the victims' families, the American people, the citizens of other countries realize the steps we went to answer the question, was this a criminal act? Now, the videotape was made by the CIA. I'll go back to the statement of having any access to any resources we needed. I looked around the government. Many people helped me in the best capability to do the analytical work, the scientific work. People with PhDs in computers was there, so we asked them to. We provided the details. NTSB and the investigative team provided the details. We knew a lot. We had all the radar, we had the black boxes, and as you'll see, we had an infrared signature from an American satellite that gave us the exact time of the big explosion that most witnesses saw. We went to numerous witnesses and used GPS, the geopositioning satellite system, to identify the witnesses on the Earth. We knew exactly where they were. Of course, that's a function of their memory of where they were. But to the extent possible, we knew where they were. We knew the azimuth they were looking at, the vector. We had a lot of information. If you were doing a calculus exercise, you had a lot of the unknowns plugged in. So we turned over this information to the agency, and they worked very professionally, very competently, for a long period of time to put this together. We asked them to answer the question, what did the witnesses see? Or what could the witnesses see? The first people we had to convince that they could see something else was ourselves. We had no forensic evidence. We can't find any piece of the plane that has any missile evidence to it, but we still have 244 people that saw something in the sky, and we thought that needs to be addressed. I'd like to thank George Tenet for providing so many resources to do this. So I'd also like to caution anyone out there that would view this videotape at this point, especially the family members. They may not want to view it. I'm not discouraging you to look at it, but even though it's animation, it's a little tough to look at because it's so realistic. Steve, could you play the videotape, please?
The following program was produced by the Central Intelligence Agency. July 17th, 1996, 8:19 p.m. Trans-World Airlines Flight 800 departs from New York's John F. Kennedy Airport en route to Paris. 12 minutes into the flight, as the airliner climbs to its cruising altitude, there is a catastrophic explosion, and Boeing 747 plunges into the Atlantic Ocean 9 miles off the coast of Long Island. All 230 people aboard perish, making it one of the most lethal disasters in commercial aviation history. Since that tragic night, more than 1 year ago, investigators have been working continuously seeking the source of the explosion. They have focused on 3 possible causes: a bomb, a missile, or a mechanical failure. Of particular concern to FBI investigators were reports from dozens of eyewitnesses who, on the evening of July 17th, recalled seeing an object, usually described as a flare or firework, ascend and culminate in an explosion.
Arching from like my right to my left.
A lot of people saw things in the sky, and a lot of people saw what we think is the same thing. Those witnesses they're good people, and they told us what they saw.
I'd like to know what I saw. I'd like to put it to rest.
I'd feel a lot better if I knew that someone wasn't out there in a boat with a missile.
Was it a missile? Did foreign terrorists destroy the aircraft? At the request of the FBI, CIA weapons analysts looked into this possibility. The CIA's conclusion? The eyewitnesses did not see a missile. The eyewitness sightings of greatest concern, the ones originally interpreted to be of a possible missile attack, took place after the aircraft exploded. What these eyewitnesses saw was in fact the Boeing 747 in various stages of crippled flight. About 12 minutes after takeoff, the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder aboard Flight 800 suddenly ceased operating. These devices carry their own clocks and record time along with other information. The flight data recorder registered no unusual activity before it stopped working. However, the cockpit voice recorder registered a fraction of a second of loud noise just before it stopped. National Transportation Safety Board analysts concluded this sound was associated with the beginning of the destruction of the aircraft. Based on flight recorder data and airport radar tracking, the aircraft's location, altitude, speed, and heading at the instant the recorder stopped are known. This information was used to determine the distance and direction from the aircraft to each eyewitness at the moment the aircraft exploded, making it possible to calculate how long sound from the explosion took to reach each eyewitness, and to associate what eyewitnesses heard with what they saw. To understand this concept, consider the technique used to determine how far away a lightning strike is. This is done by measuring the delay between when an observer sees a lightning strike and hears the thunder it causes. The delay occurs because sound travels about 1,100 feet per second, and light is nearly instantaneous. An observer who hears thunder 5 seconds after seeing lightning knows that the lightning strike is approximately 1 mile away. On the evening of July 17th, many eyewitnesses reported hearing a loud boom as part of their observations. The closest of these eyewitnesses was more than 8 miles from where Flight 800 exploded. Any sound heard at that distance and produced in the aircraft before the recording ended would have been recorded. So we can be confident that no loud sound was produced before the one at the end of the cockpit voice recording. Using this fact, it was possible to associate many eyewitnesses' visual observations with things happening to Flight 800. For instance, analysts knew when Flight 800 exploded, but when did the aircraft hit the water? One observer in a beachfront condo reported to FBI agents that he saw a huge, intense, orange, yellow, and red fireball drop from the sky into the ocean. Immediately after the fireball hit the water, he heard a loud boom. It took sound 49 seconds to travel the 10 miles from the position where the plane exploded to where this eyewitness was located. So his statement established that the aircraft exploded about 49 seconds before it hit the water. A second eyewitness was located in a boat 8.8 miles from where the aircraft exploded. He observed the latter stages of the disaster, describing what he thought might be a shooting star moving in a downward 45-degree sloping arc. He then realized he was observing an aircraft. He saw one wing separate from the fuselage and a large fire trail of burning fuel erupt. Just as the wings separated, he heard a loud concussion sound. plane and wing then quickly dropped about a mile to the water's surface. Knowing this eyewitness's distance from the aircraft when it exploded, analysts were able to calculate that the concussion sound he heard originated 42 seconds earlier. Therefore, the structural failure and fire eruption he saw began 42 seconds after the onboard recordings ended. This event was corroborated by an infrared sensor aboard a U.S. satellite, which detected a large heat source in the vicinity of the aircraft about 43 seconds after the recordings ended. A third eyewitness was a passenger on U.S. Air Flight 217. This eyewitness reported seeing a small aircraft fly under him 10 seconds before the appearance of a small flare-like projectile traveling in an east-northeasterly direction. Radar tracking of Flight 217 and the small aircraft shows that he first saw the flare-like object almost exactly when Flight 800's cockpit voice recorder detected an onboard explosion. He also specified where the flare-like object first appeared, which coincided with where Flight 800 was when it exploded. And his statement that the flare-like object was traveling in an east-northeasterly direction agrees with the direction that Flight 800 is known to have been traveling when it exploded. So the flare-like object he saw almost certainly was Flight 800 just after it exploded, not a missile. A fourth eyewitness reported that he watched a white light, perhaps a firework, traveling upward at a steep angle with respect to the horizon. The light zigzagged as it rose, and at the apex of its travel arched over and disappeared. This observation lasted about 15 seconds. 3 seconds later, a fireball appeared in the sky near where the light disappeared. The eyewitness specified a landmark over which the white light first appeared, a house near the beach, and a second in which the descending fireball disappeared. FBI investigators determined precisely where the eyewitness was standing and then measured the line of sight angle between the eyewitness and each of the two houses. Calculations based on the flight path of Flight 800 with respect to this eyewitness show that when the aircraft exploded, it was just passing over the house above which the white light first appeared. So the white light the eyewitness saw very likely was the aircraft briefly ascending and arching over after it exploded, rather than a missile attacking the aircraft. This eyewitness's visual observations are consistent with the aircraft's known horizontal motion during the 49 seconds which elapsed after the onboard recordings ended. Radar data show that during this time, the aircraft traveled about 15 degrees from right to left with respect to this eyewitness, placing it near where the eyewitness claimed the fireball disappeared, behind the second house. Using these eyewitness reports and radar tracking data, CIA analysts were able to reconstruct the approximate path of Flight 800 from the instant its recordings ended until it struck the water. The following sequence of events is based on that analysis. Just after the aircraft exploded, it pitched up abruptly and climbed several thousand feet from its last recorded altitude of about 13,800 feet to a maximum altitude of about 17,000 feet. This is consistent with information provided by NTSB investigators and Boeing engineers, who determined that the front third of the aircraft, including the cockpit, separated from the fuselage within 4 seconds after the aircraft exploded. This significant sudden loss of mass from the front of the aircraft caused the rapid pitch up and climb. The explosion, although very loud, was not seen by any known eyewitness. However, the subsequent small fire, trailing from the aircraft, was visible to a few of the closest eyewitnesses on land, sea, and in other aircraft. It was repeatedly described as an ascending white light resembling a flare or firework, but it was difficult to see against the relatively light sky. Shortly after Flight 800 reached the peak of its ascent, about 20 seconds after it exploded, a fireball erupted from the aircraft. This was clearly visible to many eyewitnesses. The aircraft then went into a very steep and rapid descent. As the aircraft descended, it produced an increasingly visible fire trail. When the jet reached an altitude of roughly 1 mile, about 42 seconds after it exploded, its left wing separated from the fuselage, releasing unburned fuel. The fuel's subsequent ignition and blaze produced a dramatic cascade of flames, visible to eyewitnesses more than 40 miles away, and detected by an infrared sensor aboard a U.S. satellite. About 7 seconds after the left wing detached, and 49 seconds after the initial explosion, the burning debris hit the water. CIA analysts developed this model using observations from key eyewitnesses who were closest to the disaster and who provided detailed descriptions of what they saw and heard. This portrayal was then evaluated against descriptions provided by more than 200 additional eyewitnesses. Not surprisingly, most eyewitnesses saw only the most conspicuous segment of the disaster, the fire trail and cascade of flames in the 10 to 15 seconds before the aircraft hit the water. Analysts used two techniques to determine that these eyewitnesses saw only the end of the aircraft's descent. First, sound from the aircraft's explosion took more than 40 seconds to reach each of the 58 eyewitnesses who reported hearing sounds associated with the disaster. Therefore, any events eyewitnesses reported seeing at about the time they heard the first sound took place well after the explosion. In fact, this technique was used to determine that one eyewitness's observations began more than 17 seconds after the aircraft hit the water. Second, many eyewitnesses, including most of those who reported hearing sounds, described only events that happened within about 10 seconds of when the left wing detached from the fuselage. This was an extraordinary sight, as two distinct fireballs and a trailing cascade of flames caused by the burning fuel fell to the ocean. Since the left wing is believed to have detached about 42 seconds after the aircraft exploded, none of these observers, a total of 223, saw events occurring near the time when the recordings ended. So, of the 244 eyewitness reports analyzed by the CIA, most described observations made only during the final moments of the disaster, well after the aircraft exploded. The 21 eyewitnesses whose observations began earlier described what almost certainly was the aircraft in various stages of crippled flight after it exploded. Those who said they saw something ascend and culminate in an explosion probably saw the burning aircraft ascend and erupt into a fireball just after it reached its maximum altitude. From a distance of 9 miles or more, this may have looked like a missile attacking an aircraft. But nothing in their statements leads CIA analysts to conclude that these eyewitnesses in fact saw a missile. Indeed, several eyewitnesses who suspected that they had watched a missile destroy an aircraft were puzzled that they hadn't actually seen the aircraft before the missile hit it. The airliner should have been visible to any observer witnessing a missile approach it. So the eyewitnesses almost certainly saw only the burning aircraft without realizing it. To date, there is no evidence that anyone saw a missile shoot down TWA Flight 800. Initial speculation that a missile was involved was based totally on the statements of eyewitnesses who were seeking to assist the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the National Transportation Safety Board as these agencies probed into the possible causes of the tragedy. Without the assistance of these eyewitnesses, the accounting given here would not have been possible.
The vast majority of the witnesses, 244, and I must say all 244 witnesses, we firmly believe told us what they saw. We don't question their reports. Nobody made up stories. But typically, you show up at the crime scene and witnesses see things. And I remember an armored car heist years ago I showed up at, and we interviewed 50 people. And as we say in New York, the perpetrator ended up being somewhere from 5'2" to 6'4". Eyewitnesses don't always agree. In this case, a remarkable number, the great majority of the eyewitnesses' observations fit into what we now believe with great certainty was the actual flight path of this tragedy. There were some whose statements don't agree at all. And that will always be the case. But I think a consistently high number agree with the technology, with the data, with the locations as we just viewed it. It's important to realize this video is only a very small part of the investigation. It's not the forensics, it's not the intelligence, which, by the way, was worldwide. We had the cooperation of all the intelligence agencies of this country and around the world, whose ears went to the ground and nothing concrete came of that. This videotape, you know the old saying, a picture speaks 1,000 words. I think it would have been impossible for me or anyone else, for that matter, to explain what that videotape shows. That's why we showed it. We're not engaging in some new methodology here in the FBI to try to present our views by videotape. Some things lend themselves well, I think, to photographs and for science to depict something that happened. Let me say it's essential that the public and the media and the victim's family fully understand that the FBI's and the law enforcement's team disengagement at this time from the TWA investigation is based solely on the overwhelming absence of evidence indicating a crime and the lack of any leads that could bear on the issue. In fact, we ran out of things to do. The investigation I've just described to you was done primarily by the men and women of the Terrorist Task Force here in New York, augmented by many FBI agents from around the country and many others from this office, and other segments of the law enforcement community of the United States, and by law enforcement investigators, professionals from all the law enforcement agencies. They are professionals and take great pride in their thoroughness in their investigations. Aside from the families of the victims of TWA 800, no other group of people were more eager to find the answer to this tragedy. And no other group of people are more eager to continue, I include NTSB in this statement, to find the answer to this tragedy. As the law enforcement team steps from this investigation, I want to emphasize that we will maintain our lines of communication with the National Transportation Safety Board. We'll maintain our ability to gear up our criminal investigation should any information ever come to light which would indicate that a criminal act was committed. I want to thank the individuals that supported me from the White House, the Attorney General, people from the Justice Department, the leadership of the Congress, the FBI Director, the other heads of other law enforcement agencies who provided so much support to me and the investigators during this investigation, particularly the governor of this state, the mayor of this city, the county executives of Suffolk County and Nassau, and many, many, many other people too numerous to mention. I particularly want to thank the families who, as you can imagine, many of us, including myself, became personally associated with. That night I was driving down the FDR Drive and received word from my wife that one of our agents' wife was on the plane. It became very personal for me. It became very personal for others in this office. But it was only a matter of days going to the Ramada Inn where it became personal for all the families, with all the people that were there. I'd particularly like to thank the families for all their understanding and all their patience. And I don't say this lightly. I like to thank the media. The media is the way that we put this story out. It allowed us to stand up day in and day out, some 90 times before you, and tell people what was going on. People wanted to know, and people should know. And to the extent that we got the story out, and I think almost uniformly it was good and it was accurate. We worked at that together, and I thank you for that. I'd mention to anybody watching this press conference now or later, if you have any information, we've asked this over again, if you have any information you think we should know, there's something we missed, call the FBI office here in New York City at 212-384-1000. We'd be more than happy to deal. A few words. if I didn't mention some of the team that worked so hard and so professionally on this case. I wish I could mention the 1,000 people that worked on it. I wish I could mention the names of the Navy divers and the Coast Guardsmen. Let me just introduce a few people, and I'd ask them to stand up. There were a number of people that were my immediate deputies. I'd like to introduce Tom Picard, who's now the head of the Washington Field Office, that was my deputy for this investigation here in New York. Subsequently, won't hold that against him. John O'Neill, who replaced him and was the section chief of the terrorism section in Washington at the time of this tragedy. My right hand out in Mauritius, who ran that operation. Joe Canamessa, who expertly ran the activities on the recovery of all the material. Who I know to do. Tom in the command center here in New York. Selfish, no time off, great job. The assistant tourism agent Martin. Supervisor Neil supervised this case and is the co-supervisor of the task force. Supervisor Tom Lang, who also supervisors of the task force. Supervisory Special Agent Ken Maxwell, who labored so long and so well out in Calverton and dealt with all those issues and continues to. Just a magnificent job. The case agents, Detective Tom Corrigan, NYPD. Special Agent Chris Voss, FBI. And I picked a few, actually we picked a couple of people to recognize that did such an incredible job as not only lead investigators, but dealt with the family liaison matters so expertly. Special Agent Pam Koulos and Special Agent Lou Lieber. I could mention hundreds of more people. I'm sorry I can't. At this point, I'd like to ask Jim Hall if he'd want to say a couple of words. Jim?
I'd just like to comment that I believe that a debt of gratitude is owed to the FBI for their enormous effort in trying to find out what happened to TWA Flight 800. Given the circumstances of the crash and the nature of today's world, a thorough examination by the FBI into the possibility of sabotage was the right thing to do. The scope and thoroughness of the FBI investigation is indicative of their role as our nation's premier criminal investigation agency. I am very appreciative of the good working relationship that developed between the FBI and the NTSB, both strong agencies staffed with highly motivated personnel. In the pressurized aftermath of a tragedy such as TWA 800, operational or procedural questions inevitably arise, but due in no small measure to the leadership of Director Free and Jim Kallstrom, the level of our cooperation between our two agencies was excellent. We were able to work together effectively because we shared the goal of getting to the truth of what happened to TWA 800. And I would be remiss if I did not express my appreciation to the organizations represented here today, especially the people of Suffolk County, for all they have done to facilitate the investigation and the support they continue to give us today. The National Transportation Safety Board's investigation continues. Next month, we will hold a week-long hearing on TWA 800. that will demonstrate the extraordinary effort being made to conduct an objective and far-reaching examination of all aspects of the Flight 800 tragedy. Let me assure you and the American people that the National Transportation Safety Board will continue to spare no effort to find the cause of the TWA explosion. We owe it to the American people we serve, and we owe it to the cause that we work for, transportation safety. Last year, we made a number of safety recommendations we believe would help prevent similar accidents. I trust our hearing next month will further our understanding of the circumstances of this tragedy. I want to acknowledge and thank our Vice Chairman, Robert Francis, for the excellent job he did on scene representing the board, and I appreciate the presence here today of our other board members, John Hammersmith, John Golia, and George Black. All of us wanting to be here today to thank the men and women of the FBI and the men and women of the various organizations here in New York that have worked so hard on this investigation. And again, to assure the American people that our investigation continues.
Thank you, Jim. I'd be happy at this point to take any questions. I don't know what the sources are. You know, in this day and age, a lot of people say a lot of things. And well, hey, this is what happens. We live in the, we've got a foot in the information age. And things like that happen all the time. People say, in fact, there was a show, people say the damnedest things. None of that is true. No, absolutely not. Yes, sir. Well, I think there were a couple of key moments when NTSB, through their great analysis, and the team really came to the conclusion the center fuel tank exploded. I think that was a key moment. When we had a lot of the plane, when we started having 80–90% of the plane, and we looked at so much of the plane and saw no forensics. But I'll say again, I mean, what we thought from the beginning or didn't think, what we thought 6 months out or 12 months out, didn't change one scintilla anything we did. Wouldn't have put any new leads on the board, wouldn't have changed any of the theories. Yes, sir. I thought you'd ask that. Well, to the best of our ability, and I haven't really taken the time, I'm sure there's some accountants in the FBI that know this to a penny. But I would guess around $14 million, could be as high as $20 million for us, not for the National Transportation Safety Board. A lot of resources, let me just say, a lot of money, a lot of human resources that were taken off other work to do this. The decision to stay with this as long as we did and do these things was not one that we took willy-nilly. Many other things that we didn't do because we were doing this. Yes, ma'am. Well, as you know, we'd never comment on ongoing investigation. So I'm not going to comment on that one way or the other. But we're well aware of our responsibility. We're well aware of the things that we investigate. And certainly as we move ahead in this investigation, if something falls within the purview of our jurisdiction, you know, in consultation with the United States Attorney, we'll take whatever appropriate action is necessary. Well, I would I direct you to 18 U.S. Code, Section 1001, and 49 U.S. Code, Section 46310, for some further reading on some potential areas. In the progress of this investigation, and this press conference in particular, I'd rather not get into the details. It's quite lengthy. But it would have to do with people intentionally violating procedures and certification processes and other things like that. Excuse me? The question was, could TWA plant a story? I have no idea who would do that. I wouldn't think that TWA would do something like that, but I have no idea. Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, there may very well be people that are upset with the result. All I can tell you is we did a thorough, total, comprehensive, redundant investigation. There's not one scintilla of evidence. If people were to look at this fairly, and as a matter of fact, I mean, this mock-up is going to be around for years, I'm sure. Will be the subject of litigation. But there is no evidence of it. So people can have whatever opinion they want. I think the great majority of people out there will understand that was not the case. I wouldn't comment on that. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Kallstrom, the FBI has come under some criticism for perhaps staying in this investigation longer than it should have. Can you address that?
I think we stayed as long as we needed to. I mean, imagine the notion of us looking for the obvious things in an investigation, not finding them, and sort of vacating the scene. I mean, we're the Federal Bureau of Total Investigation. We try to be. I try to be. Not the Federal Bureau of the obvious. I mean, we have to look at everything possible. We have to look, I mean, we've got 230 people that died here. We've got whole families, children. We have to look at every dark crack and crevice of this investigation. We did the right thing. We didn't have the mock-up until not that many months ago, and we wanted to do the analysis of all the holes in relationship to each other. We wanted to bring in another metallurgist to look at all the holes and agree with the prior metallurgist. These are reasonable things to do. To do any less would be unprofessional. And we would not be forced to do something like that just to satisfy some talking head on some television show. Would never happen. Yes, sir.
To go with your number of the 14 to 20 million, I wonder if Chairman Hall has an approximate number on the ESP figure.
Of course, we have had appropriated some $30 million that has been expended. The expenses will continue, the main expense being the rent at the Calverton and security at the Calverton hangar and other tests that we have underway. In addition, there was supplemental appropriations by Congress of approximately $10 million to reimburse many of the local agencies and organizations for their overtime and extra activity in this area. Again, we haven't attempted in as great a detail as the FBI has to try and gather all the costs, so those are very approximate costs at this point.
Have TWA or Boeing contributed any costs to either of your...
Well, why don't we finish with questions with Mr. Kallstrom?
It could be. I'm not aware of that, but I'm sure that they've done things for some things that I'm not aware of. Yes, in the back.
With no disrespect intended to the agency's work, we're trying to reassure the American public, and one of the things the American public has heard about in recent years is some questions about the FBI's recent capabilities in recent years vis-a-vis years past and glory days. There's even exchange of personnel. If there are lingering doubts about that aspect of it, because you did numerous tests and so on, what would you say?
Well, you know, I feel extremely confident in the test results. I feel extremely competent and confident of the FBI personnel from our laboratory that did the testing. That was also looked at by the ATF laboratory. That was also looked at by independent consultants. You know, I think we have a multi-layered position on that. We didn't take the word of one particular person. The FBI laboratory does millions of examinations every year. They do it brilliantly. You know, we're all human beings. We make mistakes from time to time. That's why we built in redundant eyes. That's why we built in redundant procedures, so that we wouldn't let something like that fall through the cracks. But I have nothing but the highest regard for the people that were there, that worked 20-hour days, you know, that did great things. It's a good question, though. I understand it. Yes, sir.
Is there any reason to believe that any of the parts of the plane that have not been recovered would have caused any further steps to be taken in the criminal investigation, or could shed light in the criminal?
Well, you know, there are some parts that were not recovered. We feel that even if we recovered the parts, that we don't think they would advance the criminal investigation any. We think we have enough of the plane to make the determination we made. Certainly we'd accept any parts. If there's any fishermen out there, obviously, and I don't say this kiddingly, if you bring up a piece of this aircraft while you're out there scraping the bottom for clams or oysters or whatever you're doing, you know, we want that piece of the plane. And I'm sure NTSB would also want any other thing that we could find. Certainly the fuel pump that is missing.
Mr. Hall?
Yes.
What is the status of the FBI from here on? Are you going to maintain the crime scene? Are you going to keep...
We're going to, at the request of NTSB, we are going to maintain the Calverton facility. We're going to maintain the security of that. We're going to assist NTSB in whatever they ask us to do. And as I said, if something comes up, we don't expect that it will, but if it does, we'll jump in there with both feet as quickly as possible.
So are you literally ending your investigation?
We are. We're putting it in pending and active. It's an internal term, but we're not writing a big closed on it and putting in some dusty safe somewhere. We're just sitting it somewhere and looking at it.
What about the grand jury? Did Mr. Tony's appearance mean that the grand jury investigating this is closed, gone home?
You know very well we can't comment on the grand jury. And we can't comment on any ongoing criminal investigations. I'm not trying to be coy, but we just can't talk about that. Yes, sir. That's right, and I said, right, I said I think the extraordinary nature of this investigation, the fact that this has been not only one of the most tragic situations ever in the world, but also one of the most massive investigations involving so many agencies. Something that we can all relate to. We all fly, we put our children on airplanes. We felt the necessity to stand up here and talk about what we did. We want the people watching this to know that we left no stone unturned. In fact, we looked under every rock 10 times. You know, we measured 10 times and cut once. And that's why we're talking about it today.
Just to follow, does it have anything else to do with as well, all these stories that have swirled around for the past 16 months? Is that also a point of it? If you want to...
I don't understand that.
There have been stories for 16 months in all different directions. Yet you have all the information, and you're not going to let any of those stories hold any water based on what you believe.
Well, all I can tell you is what we did, and I can give you the conclusions we reached. I can give you the basis for those, which I tried to do today. You know, we can stand up here and tell you the facts, and that's what it is. And I think that's what everyone deserves. You know, hey, people tell stories. I mean, what do you want me to do? Change the whole way people live? I mean, people are going to tell stories. You know, and I wish people would realize the ramifications of some of the stuff that they talk about. And the fact today that you can go on net and talk to 80 million people, this is new. This didn't happen back in 1960. I mean, this has ramifications. Ramifications for public policy, ramifications for heartache, ramifications for, you know, you have a home and you keep criminals out. You wouldn't let some people in your front door, yet they come in your phone line and start talking to your 12-year-old. This is a different time. You know, and there's nothing that we can stand up here by edict and do anything about. People have to be responsible, and we need more responsibility. Individual, organizations. Yes. Yes, sir.
A quick chronology question. When did the CIA first start working with you, and when did they first present their results to the FBI?
Well, I don't know the exact dates, but they started, I don't know, many months ago, 5 or 6 months ago, at least.
And when did they give you their...
Well, we had periodic updates on the information, but the actual final version of this videotape was received just a few days ago.
Question for Chairman Hall, if I could.
Yes, sir. Mr. Hall?
Yes, sir.
With the finding of the FBI not a missile, do you fear that older 747s could be flying with the fatal flaw that caused this one to blow up by itself?
Well, the board has made, as I referenced in my statement, some recommendations as a result of this accident. We have encouraged the FAA to take action on those recommendations. I have, while they have, there's been some disagreement over them, I've been heartened by the fact that both the FAA and the industry have undertaken an inspection of every aircraft, not just the 747 model, but all of the aircraft models that are flying in commercial aviation in regard to the wiring probes and other things in regard to their area around the center tank and fuel tanks. We may have other additional recommendations that will come out of this investigation as we come into any safety issue. If the board determines that it is appropriate time to make a recommendation, we will do that.
Can you satisfy the flying public that older 747s are safe?
Well, we are going to be conducting a hearing on this in particular tragedy and be going into great detail in December into the hearing of the whole issue of aging aircraft and systems on aging aircraft. Clearly, one of the things the flying public needs to be aware of in that is the safety record that we have in aviation in this country and the outstanding attention that is given by both the industry and the government regulators to aviation aircraft of all ages.
Could you tell us whether this 16-month investigation has told you anything at all about why the fuel tank exploded?
We're going to be speaking in great detail at our hearing for a week about that subject. I think this is more appropriate for questions regarding Mr. Kallstrom and the FBI's investigation.
Mr. Scott, distinguished Mr. Scott.
Question to Chairman Hall. As the FBI...
Forget Mr. Scott. No.
After that nice introduction, you do that.
The FBI has laid out so well its case against the criminal act. Is the NTSB prepared to lay out its case in similar fashion to show this was an accident and able to pinpoint as best you can what caused that sort of fuel tank?
Well, again, as I pointed out in my opening statement, the one thing that both the FBI and the NTSB are paid by the American people to do is to try and find out the truth. And we are going to spend a week in our hearing in Baltimore opening the public docket and presenting for the American people a full discussion and examination of all the information we have in regard to the TWA tragedy.
Mr. Hall, what are the ramifications of the FBI's decision to pull out of the investigation as it concerns your investigation and your ability to continue looking into the crash?
Well, I don't know that there is any ramification. We have since day one been doing our job. The FBI has been doing their job, and as has been stated by both Mr. Kallstrom and myself, I'm very proud of both of our professional staffs and the cooperative way that they have worked together, not only with the FBI and NTSB, but with all the various federal agencies in representing the public interest. We routinely work with the FBI on our accident investigations, and if any time we feel as part of any of our transportation accident investigations in any mode that there may be a criminal act, we immediately bring in the FBI. So it's not unusual for us to be working with the FBI. It's something we routinely do.
But it has in some ways made you more closed mouthed about the investigation, having the FBI there. Will this investigation be carried on more clearly in the light of day now that it's no longer considered a criminal investigation?
Well, the aspects of it that we are responsible for will be as following our procedures fully discussed and outlined in our hearing in Baltimore, yes. We have tried through the course of our investigation to bring factual information to the people, to the American people in a responsible fashion, but we will be doing that in much greater detail at the hearing in Baltimore.
We'll take two more questions.
Councilman, as far as that videotape When did they come up with that determination?
Well, I don't know the exact
They must have
moment.
communicated that to you.
Of course they did, sure. I mean, that was the question we asked them to answer. What did the witnesses see? So, you know, the key fact on that videotape, all the witnesses, all 244, saw events that happened after the center fuel tank blew up. Forget whether y'all agreed. They saw events after the center fuel tank blew up. One more. Yes, ma'am. The Air France pilot. The question was, what about the Air France pilot that I guess you think reported? Yeah, we interviewed all pilots, obviously, that saw anything. In particular, we interviewed an Air France flight crew because Mr. Salinger talked about Air France wildly diverting from their flight path to avoid a missile. The pilot recalls no such incident. The co-pilot recalls no such incident. Air France recalls no such incident. The radar vector is straight as an arrow. There's no communications on the radio back to the ATC. None of the passengers on the plane recall such an incident. It didn't happen. Thank you very much.
Next month, the National Transportation Safety Board plans to release its report into the cause of the TWA Flight 800 crash. Tomorrow on Washington Journal, our guests include Mayors Stephen Goldsmith of Indianapolis and Dennis Archer of Detroit. Also, we'll talk with Virginia Governor-elect James Gilmore. As always, we'll take your comments and questions by phone, fax, and email.